Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Winston Cornwall. I'm a civil rights specialist with the Oregon Department of Education's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Today's presentation is entitled Section 504 and Title II of the ADA, Lessons Learned. It's important to remember that every IEP student in a K through 12 school also receives Section 504 and ADA protection. The IEP is their specially designed instruction and their education mandate and program. Section 504 and Title II of the ADA are the civil rights or equal opportunity portion of their education. Students are protected in three ways under Section 504 of the ADA. The first bullet is in bold print is the definition of disability under Section 504. It's that a person has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major activities. This is known as a three-pronged definition, and we'll go through each of the prongs in a couple of minutes. An individual who meets this definition of disability is entitled to a free, appropriate public education and a 504 plan of accommodation and or related services. The second protection is a person who has a record or a history of such impairment. This may be someone who has a condition. The condition has since become dormant. But that person still receives disability discrimination protection under 504 in the ADA. And the third category is an individual who's regarded as having an impairment. So the person may or may actually not have the impairment, but if they're regarded or treated as such, they too also have disability discrimination protection. The first prong we talked about is physical and mental impairments. You're seeing the term on just below the title is non-exhaustive, and there's several aspects of 504 and the ADA that are non-exhaustive. What it means is that all of the conditions that are currently listed in the law could potentially be expanded and accepted prior to the next formal revision. So if we look at physical impairments, we'll see the endocrine system, which is what kind of regulates insulin and provides us challenges for students with diabetes. One of the reasons I've listed some of the impairment categories and some of the actual impairments. The impairments that I've listed in bold print are likely candidates for 504 accommodation. So if a student has insulin-dependent diabetes, which would be all type 1 students with diabetes, and some type 2 students with diabetes who test and administer insulin, they would be likely candidates for a 504 accommodation plan. The same holds in effect under neurological conditions for epilepsy or any life-threatening seizure disorder. An area that's of real important concern to the center and to educators in Oregon is traumatic brain injury. And it's important for us to look out for circumstances that are either presented to us as traumatic brain injury or maybe presented to us as a concussion that later turns into a long-term traumatic brain injury. And then the last condition I want to talk about under the respiratory category are severe allergies. So these are life-threatening allergies. So if an individual has a 911 protocol or has a formal healthcare protocol as part of their plan, that's also a person who's a likely candidate for 504 accommodation. In 2009, which was the last formal expansion of the ADA, a category was added called major bodily functions. And this looks at conditions in the gastrointestinal system. So if you see from the list that's here, conditions such as ulcerative colitis, kidney disease, Crohn's, celiacs, or gluten allergies, or potential individuals with these conditions are potential candidates for 504 accommodation. As we move on to mental conditions and psychiatric disabilities, notice we're seeing the word non-exhaustive again. We have to look at 504 students or candidates on a case-by-case basis, and each condition requires individual evaluation. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and I think we're on manual number 5, is relevant. And so conditions that are in that manual may certainly qualify for 504 accommodation, but remember, because we have the non-exhaustive provision, conditions that may not be in that manual may also be relevant. Something of note for us, especially in Oregon, are the clauses around drug and alcohol abuse. Individuals with alcoholism are still protected from 504 or ADA, under the 504 and the ADA, but not if there's alcohol abuse in school or on the job. The real interesting point for us is the second bullet. Individuals currently engaging in illegal drug use are not protected. So while Oregon has some permissions or legal uses for certain drugs, most notably marijuana, marijuana is still an illicit or illegal drug under federal law. And because 504 and the ADA are federal laws, they believe that individuals who are using marijuana are still not protected under 504. The second major prong is major life activities. Once again, we're seeing that this is a non-exhaustive list. In the left-hand column are the major life activities that were listed for 504 when the law was originated in 1973. Second from the bottom, learning was the primary condition that we would be using in educational settings to indicate the major life activity that the condition might be affecting. In 2008, notice the right-hand column expanded on those items. So things like concentrating, sleeping, eating, added a number of conditions and disorders that may qualify for 504 eligibility. Notice the two that I have on the bottom. These are examples of non-exhaustive major life activities. Interacting with others has been recognized by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for employees as a major life activity, and it's also shown up in the Ninth Circuit Court in cases for K through 12 students. So interacting with others is a major life activity. Interacting with others, and the other one is planning, and where we've seen this is planning impacts, or planning, or the other term we'll hear is executive function. As Melissa noted, that interacting with others and planning certainly affects students with TBI. Where we got the signal for planning, and we'll see this in a slide a little bit later in the presentation, is when the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights issued some guidance regarding students with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. They used planning as one of the major life activities about which OCR was concerned. Districts must provide a free, appropriate public education to each qualified student with a disability. What's important is school districts are responsible for any school in the school district's jurisdiction. So this includes public or private schools. In public schools, we have a child find and identification, evaluation, implementation, and reevaluation duty. For private schools, we have a child find or identification and evaluation responsibility. Unlike IDEA, we do not have an implementation responsibility. Remember, 504 has a provision for undue financial burden. but that really doesn't apply to students in the K through 12 system. Hence the term, regardless of the nature or severity of the disability. Free appropriate public education. Free means free, so we're not supposed to charge for any costs that are related to the disability. We can charge students usual fees that are paid for by all students. So if a debate team uses Chromebooks and the debate team charges $50 for each student to use and subsequently purchase a Chromebook, and we have a student who's deaf or hard of hearing, and that student has additional software, which makes the cost of that student's Chromebook $150, the district could only charge that student $50 because that's the usual fee that's paid for by all students. What we have to remember about Section 504 is 504 was an antecedent to the special education laws like IDEA, which we have today. So 504 can include regular or special education and related services. The way we're seeking to practice 504 in Oregon is that 504 covers students who have regular education and related services needs. And our hope is that students who require special education or specially designed instruction are using the IEP process for those services. But again, our baseline is we're providing services that are designed to meet a student's individual needs as adequately as the needs of non-disabled students are met. As we look at 504, Title II of the ADA and IDEA, these are some areas of concerns for us. One is concussions versus traumatic brain activity, TBI. Concussions are considered temporary conditions. And when there are temporary conditions in the 504 realm, institutions or school districts may have up to 6 months before they determine whether or not that condition is permanent. What we're beginning to really see statewide with some consistency are students who experience concussions and need accommodation because of the impact of the concussion on their educational environment. What we're really beginning to see is once a student hits 3 months of having those conditions, schools are beginning to actually write and implement 504 plans for those students. We're very supportive of those efforts at the Oregon Department of Education. We're reminding people that if we see diagnoses of traumatic brain injury and we have indications that is at all long-term, we're strongly encouraging people to write 504 plans as soon as possible. An area of particular concern for 504 students contains harassment and bullying. We're in a national and school climate where we're beginning to see increased bullying and aggression between different groups of folks who are interacting in school environments. If we have a student or a person with a disability and that person is experiencing harassment, that level of harassment, especially if it relates directly to the disability or it has an adverse impact on the student's education, can rise to the level of disability harassment and become a discrimination or a civil rights matter. So we really need to be attentive to students who are having those experiences. And there are times when the 504 and or IEP team may need to get involved with school administration regarding how we address and stop the harassment and bullying. Many of us are familiar with the fact that students with disabilities have to be in the least restrictive environment, which means that the students are always in a setting, in the general education setting, unless their condition requires special services, related services, or specially designed instruction. And so this is very important for us to consider. And when parents, advocates, or other interested parties express concern, these are areas with which we should be very attentive. I also want to talk about regulatory overlap for IEP students. I want to be real cautious and about this, and every once in a while I slip, and we'll get into this circumstance of where I'll say a student with insulin-dependent diabetes is automatically a 504 student. I'm concerned when we start to say that students are automatically a 504 student because we're required to evaluate every student for accommodation. And while a student with insulin-dependent diabetes is a likely candidate for 504, we clearly have to evaluate and show that we went through the process and that the process was similar to the process that other candidates for 504 accommodation experience. The second area is there are times when students are found ineligible for an IEP, and the IEP team says to a family, we'll make sure you receive a 504. That's an area of concern because like the automatic 504, it suggests that a group of individuals are finding a student eligible for Section 504 accommodation without conducting a formal evaluation. That situation is compounded if the IEP team is not actually the 504 team that determines eligibility for 504 in that school or district. Another area where this circumstance comes up is a student has met his, her, or their goals on an IEP and the student's exiting the IEP. Frequently we'll hear that exiting IEP team say, well, we'll make sure that the student has a 504 to help the student transition as they leave the IEP setting. This is similar where we need to really have an evaluation to determine whether or not the student needs an IEP. I mean, the student exiting an IEP needs a 504 plan. On the other hand, there are times when students who have IEP plans may have accommodations that are 504 based in nature, and we need to look out to make sure that those students are able to continue those accommodations. The last area of concern is when a parent revokes their IEP consent. Parents have a right to say, I no longer want my student to receive IEP services. Many of those parents will subsequently ask for 504 evaluation and accommodation. Our position at the Oregon Department of Education is that school districts, if school districts have offered specially designed instruction and IEP services under an IEP plan, if a parent decides to revoke that consent, the school district is not obliged to offer those services under another program such as 504. However, the family is entitled to a 504 evaluation to ensure that the student gets accommodations and related aids and services. An area of interest for us in Section 504, and a question we receive frequently, is when is a health plan just sufficient for a student, or when does the health plan really need to be converted into a 504 plan? And so health plans are not always sufficient to comply with 504 FAPE requirements. And if you notice the second bullet, the keys, for students with chronic health impairments and severe allergies, a 504 is likely to be preferable. One of the reasons the 504 is preferable is because the 504 provides procedural safeguards, which is another term for parent and student rights and responsibilities. It also contains non-discrimination protections, which allow parents remedies in the district, at the state level, or at the federal government level. What a 504 also does is it requires school districts to engage in child find and identify students. And the 504 process eliminates unilateral decision making because it's a team of individuals that are looking at the circumstance. Lastly, 504 plans are preferable over health plans if there are any cases where we have staff or district policies that may be antiquated, or staff have belief systems that may be antiquated. Remember, we talked about this before. The 504 is a binding contract. So what's in the 504 has to be implemented by the responsible parties. And so this is one way of addressing circumstances where staff may not feel comfortable or staff may not believe a student needs an accommodation, but that's really not the individual staff member's decision if the team has decided that item needs to be listed on the plan. Here are some circumstances that 504 teams and districts can look at. The recommendation is that we review the files of all students on health plans, but if student health plans have concerns in any of the listed areas, this may be an indicator that the team might consider a 504 plan in lieu of the health plan. And I'll just give you a moment to read through those bullet points. We talked about diabetes cases and 504 programs. This is explicit information from the Federal Office for Civil Rights, is that students with high risk of hypoglycemia or other adverse conditions must have those issues addressed. There's ideally a school nurse or the school nurse's delegate available to administer medication, that we have to be aware of the medical professionals' orders and amendments. We distribute and review protocols with all relevant staff, and we address and correct and document errors. The American Diabetes Association has been a very active partner of state organizations and the federal government in ensuring that insulin-dependent diabetes receives strong consideration. And so we've shared with our local American Diabetes Associations that we in the Oregon Department of Education, strongly recommend that insulin-dependent students be on a 504 plan. In the same breath, we've also preserved your right as school district personnel that the plan that will be implemented will be the plan that the local team creates and determines. The American Diabetes Association has examples of very comprehensive plans on its website, and parents and interested parties may bring those to school districts. School districts must consider them, but school districts have the right to choose to adopt or not adopt those plans in favor of their own plans. An area of that really comes up a lot in Section 504 regards medical diagnoses. And the question that we receive frequently is the first bullet: may a district require a parent to provide a medical diagnosis before it will initiate an evaluation or consideration of a student under Section 504? And the answer to that is no. If a district suspects that a student may need accommodation or related services because of a disability, the district has to evaluate that student regardless of whether or not the student has a medical diagnosis. The district can request information from the parent, but if the parent is unwilling or unable to provide that information, it's the district's duty to provide that information. I've seen on some district information that goes to parents on Section 504 that students must have a medical diagnosis. If the district says the student must have a medical diagnosis, essentially the district is saying that's a requirement of evaluation. And if the district really means that, then the district's really required to pay for that evaluation. Here's the difference. If the district does not suspect a disability, the district may inform the parent that it doesn't suspect a disability, but would reconsider if the parent chooses to provide further medical information to the district. This information on this slide is quoted from our ODE Section 504 handbook. There is similar information that's provided by the U.S. Department of Education Federal Office for Civil Rights. These two questions come from OCR's FAQ documents on Section 504. And so one of the questions they list is, can a medical diagnosis suffice as an evaluation for the purpose of providing FAPE? The answer to that question is no. We can consider a medical diagnosis as part of a number of sources that we would use to evaluate a student's eligibility for Section 504, but we're also including aptitude and achievement tests, teacher recommendations, physical condition, school and cultural background, and adaptive behavior. All right, so 504 constantly reminds us that when it comes to students, we need to triangulate. We should be looking at multiple sources and not be overly dependent on any one source. Here's the reciprocal question. Does a medical diagnosis of an illness automatically mean a student can receive services under 504? The answer to that is no as well. Just because a student has a medical diagnosis doesn't automatically mean that the student will get accommodation. We still have a duty to determine if the student is substantially limited in the educational environment. An area of rising concern in 504 is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I'm encouraging all of you, all of us, to review the July 26, 2016 OCR Dear Colleague letter on ADHD. The Federal Office for Civil Rights became very explicit when it addressed how we should consider students with ADHD. The reason they undertook this goal was they went through 2 successive years. I want to say it was maybe fiscal calendar year 2014 and 15 and 15 and 16, where 10% of the total complaints that they had for Section 504 or Title II involved ADHD. So they decided to give us some guidance in this Dear Colleague letter. What OCR said in this letter is contained on this page. The highlights are anyhow. And one is that the diagnosis of ADHD or ADE meets one prong of 504 definition of disability. ADHD is considered a mental impairment in the DSM-5. The second thing they looked at are some of the major life activities that ADHD may impact. And notice the list there: thinking, concentrating. Remember, we had planning on the major life activities list. And again, that's planning, organization, and executive function. An area, along with interacting with others, areas that also affect traumatic brain injury. Reading, writing, speaking, or learning, those are all areas of impact that students with ADHD experience. This information is that the OCR took is from the National Institutes of Health. So OCR also suggested that we look for signs in students: restlessness and inattention, inappropriate for age or grade level. Here's the planning again: trouble organizing tasks and activities, or communication or social skill defects. Where to look for both academic and or behavioral challenges. And here becomes a really key point. We need to examine additional time or effort and rely reasonably on academic results. Old school 504 was that if a student took a considerably longer period of time to do an assignment, but the student was successful in completing that assignment as compared to the average student, we'd say that student didn't experience substantial limitation. But however, that's changed since 2009, and it's especially relevant for students who may be looking at post-secondary education and have to take standardized college entrance exams like the SAT or the ACT, which have time limits to their testing vehicles. One of the things that students who may need extended time would need to have to get extended time on those tests is they would actually need a 504 designation and an existing 504 accommodation plan. Lastly, OCR has reminded us with students with ADHD and ADD that we should also look for coexisting disorders. The two that they mention most are depression and anxiety. So we can have a student with ADHD, and the team may find that the student's ADHD in and of itself is not substantially limiting to the student, but the anxiety that the student experiences due to testing or some other form of evaluation may be the indicator that's substantially limited. We need to remind ourselves that depression and anxiety may be coexisting disorders for many conditions. Here's a list of individuals who are traditionally listed as qualified professionals to diagnose ADHD. This information also comes from the National Institute of Mental Health. The first five in bold print, what OCR basically says in this guidance, as I understand it, so I encourage you to read to make sure you and your districts determine your own understanding. But what OCR has said is if we have a comprehensive evaluation from one of the individuals in the bold print, coupled with observations from the parent, that the parent sees some of those signs that we were on the preceding slide, that's a student who may be likely for 504 accommodation for ADHD. So the Federal Office for Civil Rights has kind of taken a clear position in the sand, if you will, around diagnosing and identifying ADHD as a 504 condition. And this is an area to which we need to pay close attention. An area of concern for us in Oregon is dyslexia, and our state legislature has taken considerable steps for us to address dyslexia. We've looked at, so my understanding is starting this past school year, every kindergartner or first grader who's entering an Oregon school has to undergo some evaluation for dyslexia. And if there are any indicators that dyslexia may exist for that student, then they're beginning to go through evaluations. One possible evaluation the student could undergo is a Section 504 evaluation for dyslexia. Dyslexia impacts major life activities such as reading, thinking, learning, writing, interacting with others. A point that we made in the prior slide around ADHD is successful performance doesn't rule out substantial limitation in major life activities. That's the example of if a student takes an extended period of time to complete a task that is significantly a longer period of time than their peer might take, that may still indicate some substantial limitation for the student. We have to remind ourselves that reading is not effortless for persons with dyslexia, and we have to consider this time and effort piece. all right? And remember, we're making a comparison of an affected student to the average student at age or grade level in a really large pool, such as the state of Oregon. Here's a slide of potential accommodations that students with dyslexia could receive under Section 504. One area is in assistive devices. Another area is credit for proficiency, where we may set a criteria to ensure that the student has mastered the skill, and we may not need the entire assignment to do it. An example is if a student's taking geometry and they have 50 questions on a test or on a homework assignment, we may say if the student achieves 95% proficiency on 30 of those questions, then maybe that shows mastery. So the student may not need to do all 50 questions. Extended time is also a factor in this area as well. When we look at assessments of dyslexia, we're in a situation that's similar to the ADHD circumstance. And I'm looking in particular here at the second bullet, that professional clinicians who assess specific learning disorders, disabilities, and dyslexia may have MAs, MSs, Master of Education, Doctorate of Education, or Doctorate of Philosophy in Education, Reading, Speak Language Pathology, School Psychology, Psychology, or Neuropsychology. Information that evaluates students' capacity around dyslexia from these professionals is information we must consider very seriously. Shifting a little bit, I'd like to speak about 504 and transfer students. So if a student is transferring into someone's district, the receiving school district has certain responsibilities. The first thing they have to do is that the team has to review the existing plan and supporting documentation. It's important that the team understand the meaning of the evaluation data and the placement options that existed for the student. What's important to remind ourselves, is that the plan with which the student brings to our district is in effect until the new district, the receiving district, meets, reviews, and reevaluates that plan. Once the team has met to review that plan, if the plan is appropriate, districts would be required to implement that plan as written. If the receiving team believes that the plan is inappropriate, the receiving team would have to conduct its own formal evaluation and then determine an educational plan that's appropriate for the student in the receiving environment. However, the receiving school should assume that the sending school, A, knows the student better than they do, and B, took appropriate eligibility and placement actions. I'm repeating myself in the bottom bullet, but the receiving school should implement the existing plan to the maximum extent possible until it has sufficient knowledge and data to perform its own reevaluation. 504 teams are comprised of professionals who have to have 3 skills. One skill is a team member must be knowledgeable about the student, and that might be our greatest challenge when we have a transfer student, that we're not fully knowledgeable about the student. Another team member needs to be knowledgeable about the placement option, the evaluative criteria that the school or district is using to assess 504 eligibility. And the third person needs to be literate in what are the potential placement options available through the district to provide said accommodations. One person can be knowledgeable in two of those areas, but we would have to have at least two people to be knowledgeable in all three areas, because we'd be making a unilateral decision if one person were knowledgeable in all three areas. Let's shift to section 504 and post-secondary transition. One of the things we have to remind ourselves is the nature of services differs at the post-secondary level. Here are some examples of how it differs. One is that a post-secondary educational institution has no duty to child find. The student at that stage is considered an adult, and the student has to self-identify and then say to the entity that I need accommodation. Eligibility is a little bit harder to establish because in the post-secondary environment, things are not non-exhaustive, so there aren't a non-exhaustive list of accommodations. The third thing, and that's the one that's probably the greatest key, is a post-secondary institution has no duty to evaluate. So the high school evaluation is important and information is important, and or the student may have to seek his, her, or their own evaluation circumstance. In post-secondary, reasonable accommodation is the higher education standard. In our K through 12 setting, FAPE is our standard. And then lastly, in post-secondary environments, academic auxiliary aids are the accommodations. So this is a finite list of information of accommodations that students receive. There is no formal transition process under section 504 for post-secondary. So one of the things that we can do for our students, especially no later than starting in junior year, is that we need to begin to teach our 504 students some self-advocacy skills. One way of doing that is having those students participate in 504 team meetings. After they participate in the meetings, they should either talk with their teachers or the school counselor or the building 504 coordinator to discuss kind of the process of the meeting. And then lastly, we should encourage the student or even show the student how to research the post-secondary school's 504 and ADA policies and procedures to understand the process. And this is a process they should begin as they're applying, and they should begin before they actually arrive on campus, because those offices are busy and backlogged, at least in the state of Oregon. I'm going to stop here because I've reached 45 minutes, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions at this time.
So Winston, I think that you answered the question. Let me turn my volume down. Are schools required to do both HP and 504 for a student? I think you answered that one correct.
Excuse me?
I think you answered the question from Lisa Dunce in the chat already.
Yeah, so I think so. I'll repeat that real briefly. So for certain conditions, and we talked about some of those, so if there are healthcare protocols for conditions like diabetes or epilepsy or traumatic brain injury or severe allergy, those students are likely to be eligible for 504, and they should be evaluated for section 504. That way the healthcare protocol actually becomes the main component of the 504 plan. And what the student receives in addition to the health protocol is procedural safeguards and non-discrimination protections.
Yeah, thank you. I thought you did answer that one already too, but then we have one more that says, how do we look at assistance on a 504 for a student who is in AP or IB classes and receiving passing grades? And I think I put in the chat that this is a great question, and that's because we get that question quite a bit that after a student has had a brain injury and they're clearly impacted, but still in advanced placement and able to get by.
So one of the things that we'd be looking at, I agree. So one of the things that we should look at is that concept of time or effort. So if the student, let's say, is a student with a brain injury, and one of the things that we're seeing is that student needs significantly more time to complete the assignment. So if it's assignments that are being completed at home, especially, it may be an assignment that the teacher believes that the student may need to take 1 hour to complete. We have students who are working 3, 4, 5 hours because they have conditions that either require them to take multiple breaks, or their processing speed is slowed, or some other factor that's related to their condition or disability is in effect. Those may be students who are in AP courses, and even though they're still getting passing grades, they're substantially limited, because if they're in an environment that's untimed, they can take as much time as they need to complete. But if they're in an environment that is timed, then in order to give that student equal opportunity, we may have to extend the time for that student, or we may have to chunk the test and give it over a period of time. Lastly, those are some of the students to which I was referring before when we said those students are likely to be going on to post-secondary education and might be taking the ACT or the SAT. The only way the ACT and Educational Testing Service, which runs the SAT and a lot of other college entrance exams, the only way that they provide accommodations for students with disabilities coming out of high school is if the student has an established 504 plan in high school. And when I say an established 504 plan, so if the student wanted to take the July SAT, Educational Testing Service might frown at us if we just if we just create the plan here at the end of May, or in fact next week will be June. They'll say, well, maybe you just created the plan. They're going to want to see evidence that the student was receiving accommodation in the school environment prior to seeking accommodation in the academic and in the testing environment. Maybe the last way I'll summarize this, and sorry for the long-winded answer, is prior to the last major change in the ADA, there almost seemed to be a prevailing attitude if there was any question as to whether or not we should accommodate, the burden would be on the individual or the family or the student, and we would tend to lean towards not accommodating. The current experience and belief system, especially by Congress when it reauthorized the ADA amendments in 2009, and they've been pretty consistent with this, is the burden of proof is really more on the institution to show why it shouldn't accommodate. And so if we have any doubt, and some think maybe we should accommodate and others think maybe we shouldn't, the consensus should really be to provide that accommodation.
And I think Tara put in the chat. And is that any different for a student that doesn't have a brain injury that would be in IB or AP classes?
Yes. So it's especially for students with brain injury, because some of those pieces around extended time or amount of time a student can complete a task are more prevalent, but this would be for any student, clearly would be for any student.
And that is the extent of the questions we have. Now's your last chance, everybody. We have a few more minutes, so if you have any more questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask directly or put them in the chat at this point. Okay, I don't see anyone typing and I don't hear anyone. So I'm assuming that means we don't have any more questions. If you do have any questions, you can email us at Siebert and we will answer. And if we don't know the answer, we will forward that on to Winston and get his official response to that. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording here. And if you are somebody watching this after it's been recorded and posted, don't forget that if you would like a certificate, you can email us at siebert.org. And there's an Ask a Librarian button. You can go to that and say, I would like a certificate, or you can email myself, mccart@uoregon.edu, or Amanda, which is A Perez, Perez, at uoregon.edu, and we will send you a certificate. So have a great day, everybody.